my brief today was to introduce the thought of Michel Foucault and to give a Christian appraisal of it, which is something like being asked to introduce the culture of Europe and compare it to Asian culture. However, I do have something to hold on to, and it is that I am convinced that Foucault is relevant to all of us here in the room, at least in as far as he is a figure whom it is impossible to ignore or to avoid in the contemporary academy. He is, after all, according to Google Scholar metrics, the most cited academic across all the arts, humanities, hard and social sciences. He outstrips Freud, he outstrips Marx, he outstrips Einstein. He's a quarter more cited than the second person on the list, who happens to be Pierre Bourdieu, if you were wondering. It gives you a sense of Foucault's footprint. His influence in the academic world that we are part of is huge. I was speaking to one of my friends when I was writing my book on Foucault and said I was doing that. He said, "I'm so pleased. My son is in an undergraduate geography program at the moment, and Foucault is all over that." So he has his fingers in so many disciplinary pies. He's indispensable for post-colonial studies, for gay and lesbian studies, for queer theory, and for sociology. He's a huge influence on other influential thinkers today, such as Judith Butler, or Edward Said, or indeed Pierre Bourdieu himself. Now, at last evening's Torrey lecture, I went into some detail about Foucault on power. So I don't want to recycle that material now. I think it'll become available if anyone's interested in that. What I want to do today is to come at him through the question of sexuality, which animates some of his later work. I want to particularly focus on the first volume of his History of Sexuality, The Will to Knowledge, published in 1976 in France and then in 1978 in English. The book begins with a study of Victorian sexuality in the Victorian age, which, as we all know, was repressed and prudish. Since those dark puritanical days, however, so the usual story goes at least, we have been sexually liberated through a revolution that leaves us free to express ourselves. Wrong, says Foucault. 180 degrees wrong. The Victorians weren't simply repressed, he argues, and the so-called revolution didn't liberate us at all. So in the first volume of his History of Sexuality, Foucault elaborates what he calls the repressive hypothesis, the very idea that Victorian sexuality was repressed and we've been freed from it now. And Foucault argues that there was, in fact, what he calls a discursive explosion about sex in the Victorian age. They couldn't stop talking about it rather than repressing it. And this interacted with a certain dynamic of repression to bring about the birth of what he calls biopolitics, the regulation and normalization of different sexual groups within society. He picks out particularly 4 of these groups: the hysterical woman, the masturbating child, the perverse adult, and the Malthusian couple. And he says, this is a direct quote, he says, "It was time for these figures, scarcely noticed in the past, to step forward and to speak, to make the difficult confession of who they were." Close quote. Now, for that to happen, the Victorian age needed to develop a set of categories and a new vocabulary to talk about these groups who had been in the shadows for so long. So the Victorian age, Foucault argues, developed a, quote, "sophisticated apparatus for producing an ever greater quantity of discourse about sex." An apparatus that proliferated sex talk and produced, again quoting Foucault, a centrifugal movement with respect to heterosexual monogamy. So in other words, we need to label and understand these groups in the Victorian period in order that they may be regulated and managed within society. That's the impetus that was behind this discursive explosion for Foucault. As for the sexual revolution, he sees it actually as a direct descendant of Christian, more precisely Catholic, confession. He sees a direct genealogy from the practice of confession to the sexual revolution. In both cases, he argues, one's deepest desires need to be articulated and spoken. And it's this speaking that is the key for Foucault. Because in Foucault's understanding of the Christian confessional and in his understanding of the sexual revolution, speaking about our desires doesn't merely register a reality that precedes that discourse, but the talking about it actively constructs the self that is being confessed. Let me let Foucault put this in his own words, so you're getting it directly from him. Quote, the notion of, and he puts it in quotes, sex made it possible to group together in an artificial unity anatomical elements, biological functions, conduct, sensations, and pleasures. And it enabled one to make use of this fictitious unity as a causal principle, an omnipresent meaning, a secret to be discovered everywhere. In other words, we draw together certain features of human existence that weren't put together before, we label it sexuality, and we retroject that now onto a fundamental level of identity. It is a construct for Foucault. And so this new category of sexuality can then be read back onto ourselves, to explain ourselves to ourselves, justifying itself to a reverse-engineered explanatory power. And so when he claims that, quote, homosexuality is a notion that dates from the 19th century and thus a recent category, we have to understand that he's not singling out homosexuality here. For Foucault, all sexuality is constructed in precisely this way, heterosexuality and homosexuality. They're both products of discourse for him. And so from the ancient world up until roughly the 18th century, give or take, he argues, same-sex intercourse was seen in terms of perhaps the difference between the active and the passive partner, or as an expression of libertinage. But what dates from the 19th century is that homosexual practice is now seen as an expression of one's deepest identity. An act, sodomy, has become an identity, homosexuality. And indeed, for Foucault, so deep is this identity that he can write of the emergence of sexuality in this way in religious terms. And let him tell you about this directly again. So, quote, we expect, he says, our intelligibility to come from what was for many centuries thought of as madness, our identity from what was perceived as a nameless urge. Hence the importance we ascribe to it, the reverential fear with which we surround it, the care we take to know it. Hence the fact that over the centuries, it has become more important to us than our soul. That's an interesting optic through which to view many changes in contemporary society, that sexuality has taken the place for people that the soul used to occupy. My deepest self, my inviolable uniqueness, the very essence of me. And this is why he's also dead set against sexual liberation and emancipation. It struck me when I was discovering Foucault as strange that this should be so. It may also strike some of us as odd that he should set himself so staunchly against the notion of sexual liberation and emancipation. That the reason that he's against it is that the rhetoric of sexual emancipation for Foucault assumes that there is some authentic essence of me waiting to be discovered inside me, waiting to be set free. But that is not the case for Foucault. Rather, for him, we create, we construct discursively our sexuality. It's not an essence inside waiting to be discovered. It is a project waiting to be undertaken. I don't discover it, I create it. And this is a key move in the queer theory that's taken a lot of its inspiration from Foucault. It's not a case of replacing one norm, heterosexuality, with another, homosexuality, but of seeking to disrupt and destabilize, or to use it as a verb, to queer all norms, leaving it clear for creative construction, clearing the ground for creative construction. And this queer lifestyle for Foucault then, and for much of queer theory, is not intimately linked or necessarily linked to same-sex attraction. Again, let him explain it to us. He says, quote, "Is it possible to create a homosexual mode of life? This notion," he says, "of a mode of life seems important to me. It seems to me that a way of life can yield a culture and an ethics." And he continues, "To be gay, I think, is not to identify with the psychological traits and the visible marks of the homosexual, but to try to define and develop a way of life." So then, to be gay, in this sense, is not to come out in the sense of publicly acknowledging the truth of one's deepest desires. It is to seek, again using queer as a verb, to queer society, to show, to take a political stance with the intention of creating a different sort of culture, one not governed by traditional norms or traditional ethics, one that is precisely queered. And cultivating a gay lifestyle, therefore, stands in relation to the creation of the modern self for Foucault, in the same way that spiritual exercises stood in relation to the creation and cultivation of the self in, for example, the medieval monastery. It's an ascesis. It's a project of self-formation and self-cultivation. He calls it an exercise of oneself in the activity of thought, by which we create ourselves as a work of art, close quote. So part of what Foucault tries to do then is to crack open the norms and the assumptions that keep us tied to rigid ways of thinking about our identity and about ourselves. He wants an open and a disrupted set of possibilities, which makes us free to create ourselves, rather than a rigid and a normative framework. So that's as much as I can say on Foucault. I want to now pivot to a Christian response to these ideas. What might one think of this from a biblical Christian point of view? I've only got time for two possible avenues of reflection here, and I need to be brief with those. The first relates to this very idea of closed and open identities, that there's a restrictive way of understanding oneself, a traditional normative way, and then there's a way that is utterly free to construct itself as it wants. I want to just look at that from a Christian point of view and ask the question of whether it is really quite as simple as Foucault would have us believe. As Christians, I think we'd want to question the simplicity of that opposition. The first thing to register, I think, is that both the traditional notion of identity, as Foucault construes it, and his own notion of identity are equally governed by a vision of the good. The traditional one positively values order and productivity, and it negatively values anarchy and disorder. Foucault's vision positively values self-transformation, self-creativity, and it negatively values rigidity and tradition and norms. Now, neither of these visions of the good is in fact more or less flexible than the other. There's a certain dogmatism in both of them. Secondly, Foucault's figures of openness to something other than traditional norms, his examples for madness and criminality and proliferating sexual pleasures, extreme sexual practices. From a Christian point of view, these actually provide a very domestic view of openness and disruption and transformation, compared to the radical openness that comes to us from the one who is radically other to us, God, in relation to his creation. God, being radically other to ourselves in a way that these practices can never be, can disrupt and transform us actually at a deeper level than Foucault can access with the resources that are open to him. And if we want to be open, if we want to take Foucault's instinct and open ourselves to something that is radically disruptive of our identity and radically open, then it could well be argued that what we actually need is to be open to divine alterity. It's an openness to God that fractures us, that remakes us, that transforms us, disrupting our self-enclosed normativity. Think of Jesus and the Pharisees disrupting these conventional, comfortable codes that we use to transform, to structure our lives. And at a more fundamental level than Foucault is able to. It's the dynamic that Paul testifies to in Galatians 2, verse 20, when he says, I have been crucified with Christ. Radical de-centering, an unordering of my identity. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And this is the twist, this is the delicious moment in Paul's discourse here. And the life that I now live. Wait a minute, I thought you just said you died. This complexity of identity, the life that I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. We could have weeks of seminars on that verse, couldn't we? The way in which identity is set forth. It was incredibly complex. And complex at a depth and in a way that Foucault would find it very hard to get to with the intellectual tools that are open to him. So what emerges then in the encounter with the cross of Christ is a self that is fractured and open to otherness, I would suggest, at its deepest level. But not another that is truly alien to me. God isn't the heteronymous instance of otherness that seeks simply to dominate me. The end of Paul, that passage that I read, makes that very clear. Christ who loved me and gave himself for me. And this is a truth beautifully captured, is it not, in the moment in Augustine's Confessions, when he says that God is interior intimo meo et superior sumo meo, higher than my highest and more inward than my inmost self. And so the Christian appraisal, I think, the mode of engaging with Foucault that I want to commend and open to discussion at this lunchtime, is not to dismiss Foucault out of hand, far from it, but in fact to validate his most fundamental desire, which is to be open to a radical transformation and a freedom from a mindless, repetitious, unthinking traditionalism. But we do, I think, also and equally need to say that Foucault himself can never fully realize this aim within the framework that he's given himself. Because madness and extreme sexual experiences can't yield an alterity and a transformation that are sufficiently radical to satisfy this desire. In order, in a sense, to be a complete Foucauldian, we need the opening to a radical, unmasterable alterity and a transformation that God alone can bring into a human life. And so, in the same way that the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom in 1 Corinthians 1, we might also suggest that the dogma of God is more transformative than human self-creation.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.